For most of human history, eating looked nothing like it does today. Our ancestors survived on foods available directly from nature: fish, meat, nuts, seeds, wild plants, roots, and seasonal fruits. Agriculture arrived relatively late in the human story, while refined flour, added sugars, packaged snacks, and ultra-processed meals became widespread only much more recently. But that history does not prove there is one perfect ancestral diet. Human diets varied greatly by climate, geography, and food availability. What it does reveal is how rapidly our food environment has changed. Today, highly processed foods are available everywhere, all year long, engineered for convenience and easy consumption. And that raises a more important question. What happened when modern nutrition advice entered this rapidly changing food environment? That changing food environment becomes even more striking when we look at how recently ultra-processed foods entered everyday life. Refined flour and sugar have existed for centuries, but for much of that time, they were less available and consumed differently than they are today. Modern supermarkets now offer an endless supply of sweetened drinks, packaged cereals, pastries, snack foods, and ready-to-eat meals, products our distant ancestors never encountered. Because many of us grew up eating these foods and watched our parents and grandparents eat them too, they can feel completely normal. But familiar does not necessarily mean historically typical or nutritionally equal to whole foods. The real issue is not that every processed food is harmful. It is that processing can change fiber, energy density, texture, and how quickly we consume calories. And this sets the stage for the next question. What happened when nutrition guidelines began shaping what Americans were encouraged to eat? That question became especially important in the late 1970s, when U.S. nutrition policy began placing greater emphasis on reducing dietary fat and limiting foods associated with saturated fat and cholesterol. Over time, many Americans came to interpret low fat as a shortcut for healthy, while carbohydrate-rich foods filled more space on the plate. The original source contrasts this approach with estimates of ancestral diets that may have contained more fat and protein and fewer carbohydrates. But there is an important scientific caution. Our ancestors did not follow one universal diet. What they ate varied dramatically by geography, climate, season, and available food. So the real question is not whether we should eat exactly like our ancestors. It is what happened as nutrition advice, refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and an expanding processed food industry began interacting in the same food environment. That is where the obesity story becomes much more complicated. And this is where the story takes a troubling turn. During the same decades that America's food environment was being transformed, obesity rates began climbing dramatically. Refined grains, sugary drinks, packaged snacks, fast food, and highly processed meals became easier to find, cheaper to buy, and harder to avoid. But timing alone does not prove that dietary guidelines, or carbohydrates themselves, caused the obesity epidemic. Our lifestyles were changing too. Portion sizes grew, daily movement declined for many people, and inexpensive, calorie-dense foods became available around the clock. Research increasingly suggests that obesity develops from a complex interaction of diet, biology, behavior, sleep, environment, medications, and genetics. So instead of searching for one dietary villain, we need to look deeper. And one of the most important pieces of that puzzle is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance helps explain an important part of that puzzle. After we eat, insulin acts like a metabolic signal, helping glucose move from the bloodstream into cells where it can be used or stored. But over time, some people become less responsive to that signal. The pancreas may compensate by producing more insulin, sometimes for years before blood sugar rises into the diabetic range. This process is strongly linked with excess body fat, especially around the abdomen and organs, but the relationship works in more than one direction. Genetics, physical activity, sleep, diet quality, medications, and other metabolic factors can all influence the risk. So it is too simple to say obesity alone causes type 2 diabetes, or that insulin resistance explains every case. What matters is the metabolic environment developing beneath the surface. And that brings us to a provocative comparison. What kinds of foods make that environment easier to create? That question leads to one of the most provocative comparisons in the original argument. In laboratory research, scientists sometimes use specially formulated diets to promote rapid weight gain and metabolic dysfunction in rodents. These diets can combine refined carbohydrates, substantial amounts of fat, and large quantities of sugar. Features that may sound uncomfortably familiar when we look at certain ultra-processed foods. But this comparison needs an important warning label. A laboratory mouse is not a human being, and an experimental rodent diet is not the same as the dietary guidelines for Americans. Animal studies can help researchers investigate biological mechanisms, but they cannot prove that the same outcome will occur in people. Still, the comparison raises a useful question. Could the real danger be less about fat or carbohydrates alone, and more about what happens when refined carbs, fat, sugar, and highly processed foods come together? And this may be where the pieces finally start coming together. Fat by itself is not automatically fattening, just as carbohydrates alone are not automatically harmful. The bigger concern appears when highly refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and calorie-dense fats are packaged together in foods designed to be easy to eat and easy to overeat. Think of donuts, cookies, pastries, pizza, ice cream, or many fast food meals. They combine intense flavor, soft textures, and high energy density while often providing less fiber and satiety than minimally processed foods. Research on ultra-processed diets suggests that this food environment can encourage people to consume more calories, which, over time, may contribute to weight gain and poorer metabolic health. Insulin is part of that biology, but it is not the entire explanation. And if the combination matters more than one nutrient alone, then the old battle between low-fat and low-carb may be asking the wrong question. That may be the more useful way to think about the low-carb versus low-fat debate. Research suggests that either approach can help some people manage weight and metabolic health when the diet is nutritionally adequate, creates an appropriate energy balance, and can actually be sustained. A lower carbohydrate pattern may work well for one person, while another may do better with more whole food carbohydrates and less fat. The problem begins when those labels distract us from food quality. A diet can be low fat and still be packed with refined grains and added sugar. It can also be low carb while relying heavily on foods high in saturated fat and low in fiber. Neither label guarantees health. The more revealing question is what fills the plate: vegetables, minimally processed proteins, fiber-rich foods, and appropriate fats, or a constant stream of highly processed calories. And nowhere is that distinction clearer than in foods marketed as low-fat. For years, the words low-fat carried a powerful health halo. Walk through a grocery store and you could find low-fat yogurt, breakfast cereal, muffins, crackers, and countless other products presented as smarter choices. But removing fat does not automatically improve a food. In some products, manufacturers may add sugar, refined starches, or other ingredients to preserve sweetness and texture. A low-fat yogurt with substantial added sugar, for example, tells a very different nutritional story from plain yogurt paired with berries and nuts. The same principle applies to cereals, breads, and snack foods. One claim on the front of the package cannot describe the whole product. Instead, look at added sugar, fiber, protein, ingredients, portion size, and the overall dietary pattern. Once we stop judging food by a single nutrient, a simpler principle begins to emerge, and it may be the most practical lesson in this entire story. And that principle brings us back to the question we started with. The most useful lesson may not be that carbohydrates are bad, fat is good, or that we should recreate an ancestral diet. It is that food quality matters. A practical first step is to build more meals around vegetables, beans, whole fruits, minimally processed protein sources, whole grains when appropriate, nuts, seeds, and other nutrient-dense foods, while gradually reducing sugary drinks and heavily processed snacks. Modern dietary guidance has also increasingly emphasized overall eating patterns rather than judging health by a single nutrient. You do not need a perfect diet or an extreme set of rules. Small changes you can maintain are more valuable than restrictions you abandon after 2 weeks. And if you have diabetes, kidney disease, heart disease, or take prescription medication, discuss major dietary changes with your healthcare professional. In the end, better health may begin with a surprisingly simple question. Not, is this low fat or low carb, but how much real food is actually on my plate?